Now, talking about finance on the continent, we have joining us here in the studio Vumile Nsweli, Chief Executive Officer of Headsley Consulting. And she's here to tell, when we talk about finance on the continent, how sustainable, how educated Africans when it comes to finance. Hi, Nsweli, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, coming all the way from South Africa, good to have you here. So let's start by finding out, from your work, you deal a whole lot with Africans, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and all of that. Financial enlightenment, education, how permeated is it among Africans?
I think it's rather limited. In essence, what we find is the majority of Africans are literally living day to day, right? We get daily wages or weekly wages, and we often focus on how can I start spending just to survive the day, let alone start to think a little bit more strategically as to how do I start generating, creating wealth, not only for myself, but for future generations. So I think if we look at, some of the first world countries versus where we are as a continent, there's a lot of development that's required for us, and I really think we need to start being a little bit more intentional about how we look at our finances.
But how do you do that when you have to survive today before you think about the future? You know what I'm saying?
They often say, count the pennies and the pounds will take care of themselves. So I think that's where we start. I believe financial behavior starts with what you have on hand, right? If you're making, let's say, 1,000 naira, 1,000 rand, are you taking 10% of that and putting it away for a rainy day? Or are you saying, actually, I've got to spend all of it? So I think it starts more about financial behavior as opposed to getting the money in. That behavior, the more you start accumulating, the easier it's going to become for you to start generating that wealth.
Is it a matter of culture?
I think it is. Often, there are lots of things in the African culture we don't like to discuss. It's very rare that we sit across the table and as a family we discuss what our finances look like. What we're seeing in Europe, that's very, very common. People are more free to discuss how much do I earn? How do I spend my money? What are my financial habits? Am I going to give up, short-term benefits for long-term gain? And we're not having those discussions. And I think it starts there. Financial education for me begins in the home. And I think also as employers, what are we doing to empower some of our employees? We're seeing some trends coming through in South Africa where some of the larger banks are starting to have financial education internally as part of their employee wellness conversations. Seeing some of those trends also come through in countries such as Rwanda as well as Kenya.
What about in Nigeria?
Well, what I love about Nigeria is that everyone loves to make money, right? And I think
what do we do with the money?
That is the challenge. Often we're more focused on appearing wealthy as opposed to creating wealth. So I think we need to start having those conversations as to how do I diversify my wealth. It's often said that the average multimillionaire has 7 revenue streams. And if we're too focused on, let me just get my salary, and then maybe I'll start a shop and that'll sort of counter some of my losses there, and all of a sudden it's like, that should be fine, but it's not. If we're going to create generational wealth, we need to be looking at those 7 revenue streams.
Well, I think one thing you said there that hit me is something that I think appears obvious in Nigeria. People who like to appear wealthy, meanwhile, they may not be really that wealthy. So how do we counter that mindset, to try to say, just be yourself. You don't have to appear wealthy. You should be wealthier than you appear.
I think it's very, very difficult, right? Because as one of my clients once said to me in a coaching session, Coach, I can't wear my title deed. So I can't necessarily show everyone how wealthy I am from an asset perspective, but how I appear, they can automatically tell. And often there's the mentality in African society that wealth begets wealth. So the appearance of wealth, then we then assume will beget wealth. And I think for me, as opposed to worrying just about assets that you put on, what does your balance sheet look like? So if we're looking at your land and buildings, we're looking at businesses you've invested in, we're looking at some of your equity, does that reflect how you dress? And if not, I think that's an internal conversation you need to have with yourself, because often it's also a little bit of a values thing, right? It's a perception thing. How do I want to be perceived and how do I want to be addressed when it comes to my wealth?
But what's the continent missing if we don't change this culture or perspective? What do we lose?
I think we will continue to have, as you know, we've got soon to be the largest population in the world, right?
Yes.
We're going to be more Africans in Africa than we've got Indians in India or Chinese in China. So if we don't start really focusing on how do we create generational wealth from a ground perspective, we will find ourselves always having to work for that next paycheck. You know, in South Africa, we've got some shocking statistics coming through. The average South African is 1.8 months paycheck away from bankruptcy.
All right. Well, it seems we have a lot to learn, you know, and to practice. Thank you so much, Bimile Msweli. Thank you for your time and for the lessons you shared with us this afternoon.